This lecture is in two parts. The first part covers pests that can infect cannabis plants and other plants, especially in a greenhouse situation. The second part of the lecture is about greenhouse design and orientation and how you can maximize sunlight in that greenhouse. And both of these things relate to each other. But the second part is I wanted to be able to cover greenhouse design, and so I tagged it on to the end of this. And these pests are often common in greenhouse situations where you have higher humidity. So check it out. One of the common pests that infects greenhouse plants much more than even regular plants just in the ground, not in a greenhouse, is damping off. It's where the root and the stem rot right near the soil line. The seedlings just kind of topple over. This is caused by a number of different types of fungi and other pathogens, but since the symptom is the same in all of them, it has one name, damping off. Wet, cold, or poor draining soil that stays moist and damp right near the place of emergence of that seedling is where the rotting can take place from that pathogen. So one thing to do is to make sure you have really well draining soil, make it warm, and use sterile seed starting mix. That can help prevent damping off and loss of seedlings in the greenhouse situation. Ants, as interesting as they are with their colony building capacities, can cause a lot of damage to plants. In general, the ants problems that we have around here are that ants infest a greenhouse, sometimes outside greenhouses too, but mostly in the greenhouses, and they will farm or herd aphids that live on the plants, your crop plants. So these aphids will start to proliferate on top of the cannabis plants, and they poke their little stylet, which is like a little needle, into the plant and suck out the juices of the plant. And then the aphids exude this sugary honeydew stuff out of their anus, and the ants eat that. So the ants farm these, just much like we farm cows to get the milk, and the ants will do lots of things to keep these aphids happy and healthy and continuing to suck the juices out of your plant. So if you get rid of the ants, it really knocks down the aphids a lot. The aphids don't do nearly as well. I've come into my greenhouse at times and seen where we had a bunch of succulents growing in the greenhouse. They were just little starts, little cuttings, and I saw soil, like potting soil from the pots of these succulents up inside the leaves, jammed inside the leaves of those cuttings. And I thought, what is going on? Did someone spill a pot of media onto these plants? And I finally realized that these ants were taking chunks of the potting media down in the pot, carrying it up into the leaves and packing it around the aphids to keep them warm at night so they would stay healthy and continue to produce honeydew. So ants as a pest, how you would control them is to keep, aphids as a pest. How do you control those? You try to keep the ants off your plants. Ants are a pest. They do eat plants somewhat, but the main damage is from the aphids that they herd. So you want to do aphid control. Reduce the humidity, introduce aphid parasites and predators, beneficial fungi like Bovaria that will actually kill the aphids, and you can use herbal oils and pesticides, herbal pesticides that can deter those aphids. And then the ants, again, you do ant prevention. You can have moats of water around your plants, or you could put each leg of a greenhouse bench in a bowl of water so the ants can't get up onto it because they're not going to swim. Boric acid is a good thing to put around, and that attracts the ants and it kills them. Cinnamon, clove, and bay leaves will repel ants. Diatomaceous earth, sticky cards like tanglefoot, which is like, almost like Vaseline that you would put around the base of a plant so the ants can't crawl over it. And even pyrethrum, which is a natural chemical that kills ants. In general, all caterpillars can damage most plants, including cannabis plants. If you look for large chunks of leaves missing from the edges of plants or droppings, that usually kind of green droppings, those are from caterpillars. Even if you don't see the caterpillars themselves, look for the signs of their damage and you'll know the problem. A few things to prevent caterpillar damage on your cannabis. Keep the seedlings indoors as long as possible. If they are plants you're going to put outside, keep them inside so the butterflies can't lay their eggs on them and develop the caterpillars on your plants. Remove the caterpillars by hand. I like to check early in the morning and just look. If I don't have too many plants, look over all of them as much as possible, the undersides of leaves and the leaf bases too, and just take them off and get rid of them. Water sprays can spray off the caterpillars. You can also use BT or Bacillus thuringiensis bacterial sprays that the caterpillars eat and die. And there's a number of other natural techniques shown here. Trichogramma is a natural predatory insect that can attack the caterpillars. Another cannabis pest is the fungus gnat. The adult fungus gnat will lay up to 400 eggs in 1 week. Their eggs are laid in the ground, and the eggs hatch, and the larvae will grow in the soil. And after about a week, they eat a lot of the roots of the plant in the first few days, like days 4 through 6, and then after about a week, they enter the pupa stage, and then they'll stay in that stage until they become an adult and more able to reproduce and lay more eggs. So some of the ways to prevent that is to prevent entry into the indoor growth areas with screens so you don't get the fungus gnats entering and contaminating, infesting your cannabis plants inside. Keep some kind of barrier so the adults can't fly in and lay eggs in the soil. You can also put barriers over the soil so the adults can't lay eggs in that soil, something to cover them, and the adults are prevented from entering the soil. Letting the soil dry out between waterings of the cannabis plants will help some of those eggs get desiccated too and just become inviable. Also, the BT, the Bacillus thuringiensis, can be sprayed on there that can kill the larva and the pupa and the adults, and a few predatory insects and animals that can also help kill the fungus gnats, and pyrethrum is kind of good. And cinnamon and oil and tea, those things are used kind of ubiquitously on different pests for cannabis and other plants. Kind of like neem oil is not on the list, but that also is something that could be sprayed on them. Although if it didn't get into the soil and onto the eggs or the pupa or the larva, it may not affect them. So neem oil is better, like for foliar. Spider mites are a really common pest in cannabis garden. They live on the underside of leaves, and they pierce the leaf tissue with their mouth parts and suck out the juices. They use webbing. They create it and use it to move around, so they look kind of like spider webs on the undersides of the leaves, sometimes on the top sides. Reducing humidity will encourage the spider mite, so high humidity environments slow them down. That's one thing you can do, although the high humidity can cause other problems, like with fungal and bacterial infections. Insecticidal soaps can help. Pyrethrum, again cinnamon or cinnamon clove tea sprayed on the plants. There's predatory mites. Bovaria, a beneficial fungus, can be sprayed on there. A brand name is Mycotrol, and then a few other things too. There's lots of things you can try, and each of these may not be completely 100% effective, but they will knock the pest down to a level that's possibly tolerable that won't influence the production of what you're trying to get out of the cannabis. And now let's switch to a little discussion about greenhouse design and construction and ways you can maximize the greenhouse space for efficiency and have it be set up so it provides the plants with their needed environmental attributes. Here are some major components of the structural parts of a greenhouse. You have vents, often on the top, to let out the hot air to cool it down and allow some fresh air to enter through the side vents. The ridge is just the very top ridge on this type of even span greenhouse. A purlin are these bars or sometimes it's wood that run the length of the roof, but not at the ridge or at the eave. Cooling fans are on the side, or vents to let cool air in the sides, filtering it or humidifying it, and it's sucked upwards by the warm air inside, moving out toward the vents at the top or the ventilator. Trusses are the side pieces that hold up the roof, usually at an angle, and you've got anchor support posts along the side walls, and then the whole side wall at the bottom, and inside you can see benches and the plants in there too. There's usually a door somewhere so you can get in. Those are the major kind of structural components to know about. One shape of a greenhouse is an even span. It's usually self-supporting. It can be up against a building or freestanding, but it's an even distance between the ridge and both sides So between the eave and the ridge is equidistant. It's kind of like a typical, very conventional home where the roof line is peaked and it tapers down on the sides. It can accommodate 2 to 3 rows of benches because the sidewalls are usually vertical or close to vertical. So it's good, a nice space inside to work in. You have more space for plants, more square footage than something that's just like an A-frame. It costs a little bit more to heat if it's freestanding or if it's not up against a house. Because of that, it's got the ambient atmospheric air all around it, so it's going to lose more heat to the atmosphere, but more flexible use of space, and it provides a lot of good light penetration to the interior. Here's a smattering of other styles and shapes of greenhouses: the Quonset style, dome, Gothic arch, the A-frame, the gable roof. It's kind of like what we just talked about with the even span. And there's some that can be built into the side of a hill. And then the slant-sided, slant leg style. These are all common. And for all of these with straight or flat planar walls, usually you're using something more like rigid polyethylene or glass. With the Gothic and the Quonset, you can also use polyethylene plastic sheets that's very flexible to cover them. Greenhouse shapes can affect the amount of light that's transmitted through their walls and roof into the interior and can change whether that greenhouse heats up more or less. The standard greenhouse shape is just like a house, the peaked roof and the vertical walls. They can let a lot of light in, but also if the angle of the sun's rays hits the sidewalls or the roof of that greenhouse at an oblique angle, so less than 90 degrees, a lot of it can reflect off of that greenhouse and not be transmitted inside the greenhouse to heat up the interior. So the closer that angle is to 90 degrees, the ideal angle for the transmission of the most energy of the sun through and into the greenhouse is 90 degrees. So if your walls are a little bit angled, so the sun's rays hit those walls at 90 degrees, that would be prime for heating that up the most, and same with the roof. So in a colder climate area, if you want that to stay warm during the winter, and you do have sun during the winter, you'd want to have more angled sidewalls so that the sun's rays hit that more of a 90-degree angle. You can see this is not 90, but it's pretty close here. They're showing you the arrows as the sun's rays. The roof is not going to be a 90-degree angle of incidence of the sun's rays to the side, to the roof there, so a lot of that will reflect off and won't be transmitted inside. Now, if you're building a greenhouse and you're designing it in a warm climate, you would want more of oblique angles. You would not want the sun's rays to hit the sidewalls or the roof at 90 degrees, which would transmit too much of the sun's energy into heat inside and heat it up too much. So those are just some things to think about when you're designing it and choosing a greenhouse style for your climate. Here's another style of greenhouse, and you can see how the sun's rays hit the sidewalls on the very bottom there, on the sides, not the roof, at almost a perfect 90-degree angle. So this would be great in a cold climate. The roof, you would want to minimize the roof because there's a lot of reflection going off because it's not at a 90-degree, but you could make the roof smaller and the sidewalls larger to transmit more heat into the interior. Overall, this is a nice shape, although inside with the angled walls can be a little awkward to work with. And kind of a compromise between the last two styles would be a kind of a two-part roof where you have some vertical walls and then you have angled walls and then a small roof, where the angled wall is maximizing the sun's incidence of radiation. You get a lot of heating happening, and then the vertical walls are minimized at the bottom there, but you still have that nice vertical wall that's up 3 to 5 feet that makes it easier to work inside of and have benches that are straight up and down right against the sidewalls. There are basically two types of greenhouse materials. There's glass and there are plastic products. Traditional glass greenhouses are great. The advantages are there are lots of designs that can go with any kind of building styles. They can look really beautiful like formal conservatories, and they can be a little more rustic too with wood frames. Aluminum frames are available too, and those are maintenance free. They almost need almost zero maintenance their entire life. They look attractive, provide large growing area for plants. A lot of these styles are usually pretty weather tight, and you can often put them together yourself. Some of the disadvantages of glass are the panes are easily broken, they're expensive, they require a much stronger structure to put them in than fiberglass and plastic. So those are some of the problems. But another, there's pros and cons, and one of the advantages that isn't mentioned here is that glass is easily replaced. Usually they're in these smaller panes in the way the greenhouse is structured, so that if they do break, you can replace that pretty easily. And glass will last almost forever if it's not broken. So it's fragile but durable, expensive but attractive, and a lot of light is transmitted through it. So plastic is just a generic word for these fiberglass type greenhouses. Some of the advantages to a fiberglass greenhouse would be that the walls are lightweight, they're strong, the materials are easy to obtain, and they're less expensive than glass. Some of the disadvantages of the fiberglass are that the fiberglass panes will discolor and turn more opaque over time, and that reduces light penetration. But using a good grade of fiberglass, a high quality, may make your fiberglass as expensive to build as a glass one. So there's just some pros or cons to fiberglass use. If you do select fiberglass, choose the clearest grade and not the colored one, because they both are going to fade to more opaque and reduce light transmission. So you want to start with the clearest that you can, although the clearest fiberglass is going to be the more expensive part too. Plastic walled greenhouses have advantages and disadvantages as well. Some of the advantages are the cost per square foot is much less than the cost of glass. As easily heated as glass greenhouses, the plastic wall is pretty well insulated. Crops can grow well under plastic and almost similar quality to the quality of crops grown under glass greenhouses. And the plastic styles are considered temporary structures and usually carry a low assessment rate for taxes. So if you put a glass greenhouse in, they often are considered a permanent structure and have to be assessed for taxes, and it can be a little bit hard to even permit them. The three different types of plastic walled greenhouses are polyethylene, PVC, and copolymers of those two. Polyethylene greenhouses are made of those kind of flexible plastic sheets that can be rolled out and stretched over something like a Quonset hut or a dome greenhouse. And these usually only last through one season before they rip or wear out. They can be fairly good at insulating, not as good as fiberglass or glass, but good enough. They're lightweight, cheap, inexpensive, they're durable, lot of light gets penetrated through this polyethylene. A disadvantage is they, like I said, they deteriorate and you got to replace them every year. But there's pros and cons in different situations. Here in Southern California, polyethylene is really well used because it doesn't get that cold, so we need them for a short period of the cold season and not even needing that much insulation even during the cold season. So they can work around here. PVC greenhouses, or the walls made of PVC, that is a more rigid plastic material, polyvinyl chloride, and they can also be clear vinyl too. These are soft and more pliable, a little more flexible. You can get them easily and replace the panels fairly easily. This is a picture of ours at City College. And so that's made of this PVC type plastic walled material. They're pretty durable. They last 5 to 10 years. You can recycle the plastic when you're done. They do cost more than those flexible sheets of polyethylene plastic, and they do tend to attract dust and dirt from the air, and they need to be washed. They get mold growing on them, and they do become more opaque as time goes by as well. Lastly, I'll quickly just mention that the orientation of the greenhouse, east, west, north, south, or anywhere in between, is important too for the transmission of light into the greenhouse. Here in the northern hemisphere, the sun is in the southern sky all the time. It's lower in the southern sky in the winter, and it's higher in the southern sky in the summer, but it's never straight overhead and never in the northern sky because of the way the Earth's tilted and the angle of the sun compared to being in the northern hemisphere. So you might want to, in this situation here in like somewhere like Santa Barbara, it'd be better if you have a length of your greenhouse be facing south if you want a lot of good exposure. You want a lot of sun coming in and pouring into the greenhouse all day long. But our greenhouse on campus at Santa Barbara City College, we have it oriented north-south, so it's actually got the width of it is facing the southern sky where most of the sun comes. So we minimize the amount of solar radiation hitting the greenhouse instead of having it go east-west, which would maximize the amount of sun hitting it, because it's already warm here and we get a lot of sun, and our greenhouse tend to it gets too hot too often. We are often opening it up in the late spring and summer, all spring and summer long, midday, and it's over 100 degrees. So we're trying to minimize solar incidence on that building, and that would be placing it north-south so the sun hits it at a shorter period of time and on the width of it. And the last three slides are pictures I will show you of a greenhouse I helped build in Kenya. This is a very simple design of poles that can be transported easily just on a truck. Each of these poles, which are the side walls and the roof posts too, and there's no ridge post on this, but they are all held up in short lengths, slid together, and then the posts on the side walls are just hammered into the ground. And what happens at this point is the plastic is then stretched over the top, the polyethylene plastic, to create this greenhouse here. This was a project I was working on with a orphanage in rural Kenya, about 3 hours south of Nairobi, and they wanted to build this greenhouse. It's pretty warm there, so they didn't really need to create a warmer space for the plants. It was helpful to grow things inside of there for a couple of reasons. One was they could keep the humidity in, so if they irrigate the plants inside here and it would warm up, it would keep the water in that system instead of having it evaporate into the atmosphere as quickly as it does in these outdoor crops. But the main reason they wanted this was to reduce vandalism. Most of the crops that they grow, you're seeing them there in the foreground, get stolen. A lot of the food gets stolen. There's a lot of people that are looking for food or produce to sell. And although this is only a polyethylene plastic walled and roofed greenhouse, it's not super secure, it's more secure. And it was harder for vandals to get in, or people walking by can't just walk in and take the food without being noticed as easily. And so this is just one more line of defense for that. So interesting, reason for having a greenhouse, but that is part of the case is protection from pests, which this does. This type of greenhouse could act as that too, but also protection from human pests that want to come pilfer your food. Here's the finished design. You really only needed hammers and a ladder to make this, and then the poles themselves and the plastic. And you can see how the earth is piled up around the edge of the plastic, all around the bottom, and that was to seal it so critters couldn't crawl under the plastic and get inside. There you go. There's some basics on greenhouse design and also about cannabis pests.